Good afternoon. Joanna asked me to address current French transformations in higher education, which we could loosely place under the rubric of neoliberalization, and to do so in terms of the implications of these transformations for democracy. For the past decade or so, I've been developing analysis of this kind in the US context, thinking constantly about what the neoliberal transformations of our university higher education system imply for diseducating democracy and compressing the kinds of knowledges and approaches to thinking that democracy requires. So really, this ought to be a very straightforward prospect, bringing it to the French context. However, the French changes are very different. They pertain, as you well know, to new forms of administration, new metrics, new challenges to intellectual autonomy, while in the United States, neoliberalizing the university primarily involved privatizing formerly public institutions and public aspects of the university. That is, it mainly involved moving from a public system to a private system of funding and of measurement. The nature of higher education prior to these changes in both countries was also, of course, quite different. Here in the US, the post-war, pre-neoliberal premise of higher education was that it is not just or mainly for professional training. Rather, in the post-war period, especially the period we associate with the tremendous expansion of our public land-grant universities, in the post-war period, education at the college or university level was understood above all as a great social equalizer, a key source of class mobility, and thus a substantive source of equality of opportunity. The thinking was that if every able student could go to college, then each could also dream of becoming anything, of leaving behind conditions and cultures of poverty or other forms of deprivation, of subordination, of class, racial determination, and so forth. Now, this promise in the post-war period in the United States was, of course, incomplete. It wasn't oriented until very late in the game to include those of non-white races and to include women. But it was the very promise that education ought to be the route through which anyone could lift themselves up, could become a more full and complete human being, a more complete participant in democracy, and realize their particular ambitions. That very promise was, of course, what led women and students of color to eventually pound down the doors that had been shut to them in the context of developing this promise. In addition, in the United States, the idea of a general rather than specialized education at the university level was, as I've already mentioned, bound up with the idea of developing the whole person, and it was bound up with educating a citizenry for democracy. It was in part, not entirely, but in part, a response to the experience in Europe of fascism. It was in part developed in response to concerns about mass democracy with an increasingly complex set of problems and powers occupying the nation. Mass democracy was understood as that which needed to be educated democracy. The same was true for an understanding of publicly funded research in the post-war period. Such research was presumed in the university to be undertaken according to the specific interests and commitments of the researcher. It was understood to serve the development of knowledge without explicit concern for immediate applications, whether profitable or some other kind. Now, the French situation, as you all know, has always been quite different. A smaller group of students is expected to attend university, and programs have historically been oriented much earlier towards specialization and training in various vocations. The idea of general education that we have had here in the United States until the recent neoliberal turn was never one taken up in a big way at the French university level. Now, in addition to two very different university systems or orientations toward what a university is and is for, the process of neoliberalizing the two systems has also been different. Yours, like the British, has been much more of a top-down process, whereas our neoliberalization has tended to seep in through transformations in funding, through transformations in governance, and thus through transformations in the subjectivity of academics and students themselves. As the funding model for our educational system at the university level shifted from public to private, shifted from being reliant mainly on state funding to being reliant mainly on individual tuition on the part of students, as well as donor funding and public-private partnerships on the part of research faculty. The transformations have followed from this transition rather than being imposed at a top-down level. More precisely, as the value of scholarship in the American university is increasingly measured by rankings, by Google Scholar counts, by the status of the journals in which one publishes, which are, of course, measured by the impact factor of the journal, which in turn is measured by citations of the articles that the journal publishes. Through these kinds of effects, a meaningless set of affirmations have come to govern our institutions and be accepted by most academics. And by meaningless, what I mean is the cycle of self-affirmation between Google Scholar counts, journal rankings, impact factor, citations, and so forth. That cycle itself has increasingly been accepted as a true measure of the quality of scholarship, departments, programs, and universities as a whole. That means that our problem in the United States at the site of neoliberalization is not about what has been done to us by the state or by terrible administrators, but rather our problem is what we have become, as the metrics of neoliberalism and financialization have come to saturate every dimension and domain of the academy. And as divestment from public universities has forced us to rely increasingly on tuition, on debt financing, on public-private partnerships, on corporate sponsorship of research, we have watched the university be pulled away from the kinds of critical inquiry, deep reflection, and broad education of the person for which it stood for at least a good 100 years, and instead be pulled toward questions about investment. Investment in certain kinds of curriculums and certain kinds of research, tethered directly to markets or marketability, and investment on the part of students in that which would enhance their own human capital. Now, it's not that all of this is irrelevant to the French situation, but your situation is fundamentally different. It's not that the public funding has vanished, as it did in our case, but rather that it is now being allocated according to criteria that significantly constrain the freedoms of the researcher, the breadth of the research, and the scope of curriculums. The public funding hasn't vanished, but is now being allocated in such a way that will radically divide an elite research faculty from a general core of instructional faculty, in which the latter are essentially demoted to armies of contract laborers, miserably proximate to the condition of Uber drivers. Now, there are many more differences that we might mention, and yet what I want to do now is turn to the common condition that we do face. Both kinds of forces that I have just gestured toward, the overt remaking of the state, of the university by the state that you're experiencing, and the more subtle but nonetheless powerful remaking of the university by privatizing what was public functions, public interests, and public pursuits. Both kinds of forces, those of the state and those of economic privatization, destroy what remains of the Humboldtian ethos organizing university life and pursuits. By this I mean not just that both forces destroy academic freedom of the researcher and the instructor, but rather that both destroy the core idea that the pursuit of knowledge itself must be insulated from external powerful demands, whether those of the church, those of the king, or those of the capitalist economy. The presumption was that flourishing inquiry, learning, and knowledge must be protected from the demand to serve power interests or otherwise be hopelessly corrupted, contained, and limited. Now, insulating learning, research, thinking, knowledge from external powers and its interests was never a complete project, of course. And yet, the academic freedom that it spawned, to think, to research, to write, to teach in a modestly independent way, this was not only essentially important to scholars, but to societies and democracies, as it fostered knowledge that could be an essential counterweight to the powers of the state and the economy. Let me be a little more specific here. I think too often today, academic freedom tends to be reduced to the idea of protecting our right to have views, whether in our research or in our classrooms, or academic freedom is simply reduced to the idea that we ought to be able to study and think as we wish. But academic freedom represents a much more important history and counterpower than that. Academic freedom born of the Humboldtian framework secures the very possibility of developing knowledge that does not serve existing powers, and that in fact may even expose or illuminate or resist such powers. Now, if in fact the organization of the disciplines tended to police and limit such freedoms, and if male and white supremacy also continued to determine who could actually populate the academy and what could be expressed within it, these things, both the disciplines and the men and the white people who organized and dominated the academy, these forms of power, disciplinary power, white male power, were proximate enough that they could be contested even within the academy. And many of us have spent our lives contesting these things. Neoliberalization is another matter. It's much harder to fight. The fusion of the academy with state and economic norms or imperatives literally threatens to convert the pursuit of knowledge in research and in teaching into service for capital and a technocratic state. And that is the respect in which it eliminates the moat that the Humboldtian model insisted upon building. The implications of this are quite significant. And let me just start with one that everyone, regardless of political view, should care about. And that is the threat to basic research in every field. When what is sought today, whether by corporations or by the state, is only the kind of knowledge that has immediate relevance, or as the British say, impact, only the kind of knowledge that can be understood as having immediate application. What is starved is the kind of basic research, whether in the sciences, the arts, or somewhere else, the kind of basic research that is often paradigm shifting and from which all applications emanate. So the first thing to say about the implication for the end of the Humboldtian model that neoliberalization threatens is that it actually threatens the very source of knowledge generating the applications which neoliberalization imagines itself to be seeking. The second implication is the starvation of fields that do not directly serve the state or economic interests. And of course, this is especially significant in the human sciences, or what we call the humanities and the arts and the interpretive social sciences. But in fact, it's important across all forms of critical knowledge in all disciplines. The third important implication is the effect on knowledge that would seek to break with the demands and understandings of the present. The way in which the end of the Humboldtian model also limits the capacity of knowledge to alter the framework in which we receive reality, understand particular histories, frame particular problems. In other words, neoliberalization that emphasizes the applicability, the immediate impact, the immediate use of particular forms of knowledge threatens to make the problems that we are tasked with solving solely framed by the present. And that, of course, is itself a constraint on positive thought. But it also discourages the kind of intellectual work that would break with the conditions and predicaments of the present to imagine a different order. And that is a constraint on critical and normative thought. Finally, I would say that by reducing much of the academic labor force to contract labor, where curriculums are set by others, neoliberalization fixes the knowledges and the curriculums that these laborers are hired to fill, thus depriving knowledge itself of the possibility of being renewed, renovated, transformed, adapted by scholars put into those positions. Such workers, as we know, have no more control over curriculums or course content than any other contract worker. In short, what is lost here is the aspect of knowledge, developing it, publishing it, thinking with it, teaching it, that promises to reveal rather than reiterate and cooperate with the dominant powers of society. Now, this in turn threatens to make society as a whole a less knowing and thinking place, more compliant, more subservient, in short, unfree. It is to make universities into the arms of the powers that currently govern and constitute us, not just state powers, but all kinds of social powers, rather than spaces in which we humans might think, self-make, and potentially self-govern, exercise freedom, and bring the possibility of knowledge as freedom to the rest of society. Now, I'm ending on this note because I believe that in our struggle against neoliberalization, again, whether this primary source is directives by the state or the primary source is the more slow and nonetheless toxic force that we have dealt with in the United States through privatization. In our struggle against this predicament, it's important, I believe, that we not focus mainly on our own loss of liberty or loss of guild power as scholars. I don't believe we should be focusing mainly on the problem of our own precarity or disappearing arcane fields or other such things. Why? Well, to begin with, I don't think there's much popular sympathy for scholarly guilds. So I think focusing in that area, focusing there, is a losing cause. But it's also the case that there was simply too much wrong with the academy prior to neoliberalization. Its unaccountability, its own role in reproducing hierarchies and stratifying social powers, there was too much wrong with it to defend the way that it was organized. What I do think we should defend is the importance of academic autonomy in doing the kind of basic research that every applied form of knowledge emerges from, in sustaining the kind of diverse and iconoclastic thought that is essential to democracy and to problem solving within it, to offering new frameworks for problems that can't be easily solved within existing frameworks. And I think we should defend the importance of academic autonomy in resisting the economic colonization of every aspect of society and every aspect of human being. These kinds of defenses still imply substantial academic freedom, substantial scholarly self-determination, and adequate remuneration for research and teaching across a range of disciplines. So it's not as if by shifting from defending our own condition to defending the importance of free academic inquiry and teaching for society and democracy as a whole, that we somehow surrender some part of our own economic or social demands. But I am suggesting that these demands will be best framed as a public good, not as a private interest on the part of scholars or academics. If we do the latter, I believe we are already captured by the very order of reason that we claim to resist. Thank you.